Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to explore the amazing life of the very first Mexican-American folk hero, a man that would be tried for murder 3 times, as well as conspiracy against the United States government. I am, of course, talking about the life and uncertain times of Elfego Baca. I use the term uncertain for a very good reason. Matt and I did a massive amount of research on this video, of course, before filming, and uncertain is the only word that would come to mind to describe Elfego Baca, largely because of his own exploits at self-promotion. Elfego figured out at some point in his life that he could become one of the dime novels by writing his own narrative, which is exactly what he did. The problem was, a lot of it is largely untrue. Elfego's life began February 10th, 1865. He was born in what was then known as the New Mexico Territory, somewhere around Socorro County. He was born into a family that had 2 Mexican immigrants. That would not be uncommon for that locality at the time. That lineage would lead Elfego on an amazing journey throughout the rest of his life. He would spend a lot of his life teaching Southwesterners what it meant to be Mexican American. When Elfego was around a year old, supposedly he was captured by some Navajo Indians as his family was making the trek to Kansas to become farmers. For whatever reason, after 4 days, he was returned to his parents. That isn't typical Native American behavior at the time. Children that old would almost invariably be killed because they were difficult to travel with and offered no real value to the tribe except another mouth to feed. In fact, it's largely true that Elfego likely made that up because it would show sort of as an example that he was born to be a legendary figure. Sometime after arriving in Kansas, but when Elfego was still quite young, his mother passed away. The family packed up and moved back to New Mexico, where his father became employed as a U.S. Marshal. Here's another outright fabrication on Elfego's part. When he wrote his own autobiography, he said he actually once freed his dad from being wrongfully imprisoned. None of that's true, and there's no evidence to suggest that that ever happened. One thing that is verifiably true is around the time Elfego turned 19 years old, he would be involved in one of the most amazing yet little-known gunfights in the history of the American West. I am, of course, talking about the Frisco shootout. When you were a Mexican-American growing up in the New Mexico Territory when Elfego was, you would be witness to a lot of depraved acts perpetrated by white people onto Mexicans. They truly were second-class citizens. Most of those acts committed against Mexicans were done by armed cowboys. They would come into town driving herds, get completely intoxicated, and randomly fire their guns into houses, randomly fire their guns at people, but largely on purpose, with no consequence from the law. You have to remember, this is the time in New Mexico of complete corrupt politics in the Santa Fe ring, and it's also the time of Billy the Kid. Elfego, in his memoirs, actually stated that he knew and ran around with Billy the Kid, also a complete falsification of the truth. That never happened. He was in fact challenged on that claim later on in his life, and he said he must have been confused with one or the other, and there were many people impersonating Billy the Kid at the time. In one case, in Socorro County, a gang of cowboys known as the Slaughter Gang actually castrated a poor Mexican national with no consequence. Seeing all of this going on made Elfego very angry, and he decided to buy himself a badge and sort of be a self-appointed deputy. He would ride to Frisco, New Mexico, which is now called Reserve, New Mexico, sort of on the western edge and close to Arizona. He was present in a store one day when one of the members of the Slaughter Gang, Charlie McCarty, pulled out his gun and randomly began firing it in the store. Well, Elfego attempted to arrest Charlie McCarty, and the rest of the Slaughter Gang didn't think too much of that. In this shootout that would ensue, Elfego shot a horse of Slaughter's foreman, which fell on him, later causing him to die. He also wounded another cowboy in the knee, and took Charlie McCarty to jail and dropped him off. This is where our story really gets quite interesting. At the time, there was a very peculiar sort of shelter or abode that very poor Mexicans stayed in, and it was called a jacal. And it's sort of similar to this, only it wouldn't have been near as proper of a building. They usually had dirt floors and were for the very poor only. This particular jacal that Elfego happened to be staying in had a feature that would ultimately save his life, which was the dirt floor was actually 18 inches below the floor outside. And that's important because the next day, a fellow named Hearn and some other cowboys, and the number varies, some say 40, Elfego said during his memoirs it was up to 80, over the next 36 hours would fire nothing less than 4,000 rounds into that ramshackle jacal. And obviously Elfego was not injured in any way. In fact, there's a legend that says the family that had been staying there prior left the fire on, so he made himself some tortillas during the siege. I don't believe any of that's true, but do with that information what you will. In the course of this shootout, he would kill another of the slaughter gang, a fellow named Hearn, and he would be put on trial for that, but later acquitted, as it was found he was acting within the scope of his deputized duties. The interesting thing about that was he didn't actually get deputized until after the gunfight as a manner of saving his life from, at the time, the Mexican Marshal of Frisco, New Mexico. Over the next couple of years, Elfego would become the Marshal of Frisco and Socorro County. During that period of time, he had a very peculiar way of making arrests. His reputation had grown beyond anybody's imagination as a lawman and a trick shot. Putting it mildly, people were deathly afraid of him, and they probably had reason to be. So what he would do, instead of actively going out and serving a warrant on horse, he would send the offender a letter telling them that you need to be in this jail by this date. If not, I'm going to assume the next time we meet that you're resisting arrest, and I'm going to indiscriminately shoot you down like a dog. Oddly enough, that had a very, very, very positive effect, and in fact, most of the warrants actually turned themselves in. So, kind of an effective way to go about things. Over the next 2 years, Elfego began reading the law with another judge, which was a common thing back then, and ultimately he was admitted to the bar. He practiced some in Albuquerque, but mostly in El Paso, Texas. It was during this period of time that Elfego Baca decided that he could become his own celebrity, sort of a self-invented, self-promoted Mexican-American folk hero. And back then it worked. Dime novels were everywhere. Print media had changed the landscape between reality and fiction. It didn't seem to matter what you said as long as the legend was larger than life. In fact, the bigger the lie, the more people were inclined to believe it. And this is where some of the facts and sort of truthfulness of Elfego's life starts to fade. One thing is certain, though, he was a very successful trial attorney. He later claimed in a print interview that he had defended more than 30 people that were accused of murder, and only one saw the penitentiary. There's even an anecdotal story out there where some client had telegrammed him and said, "Help, I'm in trouble, I'm on trial for murder." And Elfego telegrammed back, "I'll be there really soon with 3 eyewitnesses." An interesting sidebar to Elfego's life was his trial for conspiracy against the United States government. During this period of time, the early parts of the 20th century, Mexican politics was always in upheaval. One band of generals, one band of guerrillas would ultimately try to overthrow the government and then each other. One of these figures was Jose Inez Salazar, who was also a friend and known acquaintance and sometimes political rival of Pancho Villa. These guerrillas led an interesting life. They bounced back and forth between the Mexican and American border, sort of based on which one they were in the least amount of trouble in at the time. They would rustle cows, smuggle munitions, and were not very popular in some circles on either side of the border. One day, after having a falling out with the local Mexican government, General Salazar fled to the United States and was promptly apprehended. When that happened, he was charged with smuggling munitions into the United States. Well, what would any guerrilla gunfighter do? Mexican, by the way. Well, you would go out and hire yourself a Mexican gunfighter turned attorney in Elfego Baca. Oddly enough, though, what happened a few days before the trial, General Salazar mysteriously escaped from jail, never to be seen again, at least on the U.S. side of the border. Ultimately, Elfego Baca and a couple of his acquaintances were charged with that crime. Although charged with conspiracy, Elfego and his acquaintances were acquitted in 1915. Prior to that, he even made a failed run for the U.S. Congress, believing that the Mexican-American vote would be enough to push him over. That, in fact, did not happen, and he spent the rest of his life as an attorney, defense attorney, as well as a private investigator. Despite the fact that the Frisco shootout occurred almost 30 years before, Elfego Baca remained an extremely dangerous individual. In fact, one of the reasons he was acquitted in the General Salazar escape centers around a murder. It's up to you to figure out whether he was actually involved, but here are the actual facts. General Salazar escaped justice in November of 1914. In January of 1915, Elfego would murder Celestino Otero. He turned himself in for that crime, and it's worth noting that that was a potential witness in the escape of General Salazar. Elfego Baca didn't do any time for the murder of Otero because he claimed self-defense, and a jury agreed with him. In December of the same year, Baca was found not guilty on all charges. Despite all of those remarkable events throughout Elfego Baca's life, even Walt Disney couldn't make him more famous. In fact, Disney tried to recapture the magic of the series they had done on Davy Crockett, which was portrayed at that time by the actor Fess Parker. In the 1950s and early 60s, the world went absolutely mad over Davy Crockett. Coonskin caps were everywhere. In fact, the Ballad of Davy Crockett, I believe, was even a #1 hit or close to it. So what do if you're an enterprising TV and movie producer? You try to recapture that same lightning in a bottle using a different ethnicity in a different region. And he chose Elfego Baca. The problem was, at the time, they used an Italian-American actor named Robert Loggia, who was very young at the time, and would go on to have a very distinguished acting career in his own right. However, the series was called The 9 Lives of Elfego Baca, and safe to say, it never came close to taking off nearly as well as the series with Davy Crockett. For those of you that might remember it, I'm perhaps jogging your memory, it was a completely new fact to me, as I've never seen any of the shows. After years of declining health, Elfego Baca passed away in 1945. Even though he remains at the time the very first Mexican-American folk hero, largely to white history, his life and times are unknown, which is really too bad. He remains always controversial, he drank too much, he chased women too much, and let's be honest, he actually boasted about himself way too much. It seems to me the legend by itself would have been just fine. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and don't be afraid to like and subscribe.